Good evening. My name is Teresa Collette. I'm a professor of law at the University of St. Thomas. I'm director of the Pro-Life Center here, which is an unfunded initiative of the university, which means that it's only through the generosity of people like Hadley Arkes who are willing to come into the Twin Cities and present for us in addition to other organizations. The mission of the Pro-Life Center at the law school is to train young people in the defense of life, rebuilding a culture of life and a civilization of love. We do curricular development, we do public education and outreach, and we also, as part of our public education and outreach, host outstanding pro-life speakers. Tonight, we are absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to present Professor Hadley Arkes, the Nye professor at the Amherst College. He is the architect of the Born Alive Infant Protection Act, and even more recently has worked with congressional members in ensuring that sex-based abortions are not legally permissible in this state. There is at least some evidence that in the United States we have become sort of an abortion tourism center on this issue. Most importantly, perhaps for purposes of tonight, Professor Arkes is one of the foremost international leaders on the development of natural law theory, a theory that, of course, our founding fathers embraced, but one that is perhaps increasingly encountering some skepticism in the American legal institutions. I am absolutely delighted and honored to present Professor Hadley Arkes and his presentation on 40 years under Roe, natural law, and the right to choose. Thank you.
Thanks, Colette. Does this work? Wow. Really? Does this work? Can you hear me? We used to test it by saying, we could raise the money, but it would be wrong for sure. And that doesn't work anymore. Listen, thanks so much for having me. Thanks for coming out tonight. And I want to thank Teresa Collette for inviting me, and Jason Atkins, who's been after me to come to Minneapolis for return for a long while, and Kathy Devil. It's really lovely to be back here. I wasn't putting the accent as much on natural law tonight, but perhaps we could weave it in. It's the 40th anniversary. I hate to see this, you know, as Tom Alyatsi says, I have a face made for radio, so I hate to have the picture up while I'm on. Jeff and Cindy O'Connell have recently celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. They're married on January 20th, 1973. It was the day that Richard Nixon was inaugurated for the second time. And I was there in Washington because Jeff was one of my favorite students. He would go on to be the CAA section chief in Beirut, a distinguished career. I stayed the weekend, and on the way back, on the train, on the way back to Amherst, I changed at Penn Station in New York, and then learned of the news of what had just broken about Roe versus Wade. And I make the connection because it was the first business day after Mr. Nixon's inauguration. We know that Chief Justice Berger had gone to President Nixon and told him, this decision is coming, but we think we can hold it until after the election so that it won't get embroiled in the campaign and people have to take positions on this. You'll have to take a position. Now, of late, we've been coming together to mark with grimness the 40th anniversary of Roe versus Wade. And almost none of us who were active in the pro-life movement and the pro-life marches from those first days, none of us thought that this scourge would survive this long into the next century. In January 1978, on the 5th anniversary of Roe, I was invited to speak to an audience of 1,000 people at Faneuil Hall in Boston I noted at the time that the deaths attributable to abortion had now mounted to about 6 million. And for Jews, the number of 6 million figured to have a deeper resonance. But it didn't. And little by little, we see the corrosion of a civilization simply by noting the people who hear that 1.3 million unborn children are poisoned or dismembered each year, and it no longer strikes them as anything really worth noticing or triggering outrage. We suddenly look up and discover that the whole country is turned into a version of the old lawyer joke. You know, a lawyer is told that he'll be made a success in business and love, and if at the end he gives Satan his soul, and the lawyer says, well, what's the catch? You know, so people are told that Barack Obama is the only national Democrat who opposed that bill of ours, which we thought was the most modest first step on abortion, to protect the child who survives the abortion. The only national Democrat to come out in opposition, in fact, as the chairman of a committee back in Illinois, managed to kill that version of the bill in Illinois. And he's the first president to regard abortion explicitly in public as not merely a private liberty or a regrettable choice, but a public good, to be funded with public funds, to have every inhibition on abortion swept away, swept from the laws, with the lever of the laws to compel private businesses and religious institutions to affirm the rightness of abortion and fund it with their own funds. We have a population now that hears this kind of thing and says, oh, yes, and what's the problem? And very recently, as some of you have heard, a lobbyist for Planned Parenthood in Florida, Elisa LaPolte Snow, was willing to be quite candid in saying what most Democrats were thinking, but were too embarrassed to say when we brought forth our bill to protect the child who survives the abortion. Ms. Snow was willing to say that in her judgment, the child has no claim to the protection of the law, that the decision should be the child born alive, already out. The decision should be in the hands of the woman, the pregnant woman, as whether she has that child killed or not. That was the line we were hoping to draw on the Born Alive Act, to say whatever the right to abortion is, you must start by conceding us this point, that it cannot extend to the child who survives the abortion. But now she was willing to make explicit that, yes, it was. It did. So as Wesley Smith just pointed out, why should this right be confined then to babies who survive abortion? Why shouldn't a woman have the right then to order the killing of a child she bears if she decides, for any number of reasons at last moment, that she doesn't want it? With Mr. Obama and his party in control for 4 more years, appointing judges, the possibilities of help from the courts become ever more remote. We find ourselves now, for us, in the curious position of drinking to the health of Mr. Justice Kennedy. For some of us, that's a leap. Kennedy was one of the gang of 3 Republican appointees 20 years ago who moved to preserve Roe versus Wade rather than overturn it. But recently, he's been part of a 5-member conservative bloc reinforced by the presence of Sam Alito and John Roberts, a bloc that can be depended on, I think, to sustain one by one legislative measures coming up from the states to put restraints on abortion, whether they're requiring women to view sonograms, to undergo waiting periods, face the question of administering an anesthetic to that child about to be dismembered, or now perhaps even an abortion after the first signs of a beating heart, which can occur as early as 5.5, 6.5 weeks with vaginal ultrasound. Most people, the surveys indicate that 62% of people in the country would favor barring abortion after the first heartbeats are sounded, but they just don't know how early we can hear them. The breakthrough here came with a decision a few years ago in 2007 to sustain that federal bill barring partial birth abortion. The bloc of 5 conservative judges sustained that law, and what they essentially did, I think, was convey this notion we are in business now. Roberts, Alito, Kennedy, Thomas, Scalia, we are in business now to start sustaining a series of measures coming from the states, putting restrictions on abortion. My best construal of Justice Kennedy was that he thought it would set off a panic in the country if the court had overturned Roe versus Wade one day in a single stroke. There'd be a cry from people claiming that suddenly they were being dispossessed of what they regarded now as a first freedom, something now as a real anchor to personal freedom in the way people used to understand freedom of speech or freedom of religion. And yet most people out there, even people who call themselves pro-choice, have thought that abortions could justly be restricted in certain situations. Most people in the country don't think that abortion should be performed as a matter of convenience or to relieve financial distress or even to avert embarrassment and allow a young woman to finish school. Most people profess to think that abortions would be wrong after that heartbeat can be heard. Again, they don't seem to realize how early it can be heard, nor do they seem much aware that this would make the understanding of human life dependent on the current state of the art in amplifier science. The beating of the heart doesn't mark the beginning of human life. The zygote and embryo integrating their own functions, powering their own growth. These are the stages of a human life already existing. If something is growing, I don't understand how so many educated people don't understand this quick point. If something is growing, a life is already there. And it doesn't undergo a change of species. It cannot be anything other than a human life. And its standing as a human life has nothing to do with its height or weight or whether it speaks yet or speaks in sentences. In any case, the public, including people who are pro-choice, have been quite open to seeing abortions restricted in particular instances. And the court, with Roberts and Alito, have now opened the court to the path of decisions that always marked a better path of overruling. Through a series of decisions over a long period. People say, well, should you abort a baby because he could be hard of hearing? Because he could have Down syndrome? Would you be justified in killing anyone around you with Down syndrome? Well, would you be justified in taking the life of the baby with Down syndrome? One after another, people are willing to support these restrictions, and one after one, move after another, Roe versus Wade could be preserved as a shell while the substance could be gradually removed, and one day one takes a smaller step and saying, no, this is practically gone. We might as well now declare it to be gone. But all this depends on the continuing health of Mr. Justice Kennedy. If he's replaced by Mr. Obama, these possibilities in the art of overruling will be decisively foreclosed. And part of the sadness here was that by the presidency of George W. Bush, we were arguably poised at the threshold of the end game on abortion. I think it was within our reach to close this thing off. A few simple steps, hardly requiring even an executive order, could have set off, I think, some deep convulsive tensions in the Democratic Party in Congress, bringing us to the beginning of the end of the regime on abortion. And all it required was the willingness of Mr. Bush to speak in public and play on the most natural instincts of a political man, instincts that seem to come natural to Democrats but don't seem to be part of the makeup of Republicans who are, as we say, well-connected. To recall the story here, we might go back for a moment to what the surveys on abortion have been reporting for a long while. My friend Richard Derflinger at the Bishops' Committee has been one of the closest students of the polls over the years, and as he summed up things a long while ago, 60% of the public would reject about 90% of the abortions that were performed under Roe versus Wade and its companion case of Doe versus Bolton. But the surveys also revealed that most people in the country were opposed to any move to overrule Roe versus Wade. Now, how does one account for that discrepancy? Well, my surmise, supported by others, is that most people in the country just didn't know what was in Roe versus Wade or the reach of the abortion liberty that was brought forth in those cases. They didn't understand that under Roe and its companion case of Doe versus Bolton, it was permissible to order an abortion for any reason at all, for the entire length of the pregnancy and even when the child came out. We had one notable case, Floyd versus Anders, coming up from South Carolina in 1977, where the child was born, survived a surgery, survived for 21 days, died. The question was posed, had there been an obligation to preserve the life of the child? And the answer tendered by Judge Hainsworth was no. That is not a child protected in the law. That's a fetus marked for termination, which is to say, the right to an abortion entails the right to an effective abortion or a dead child. Well, that was the possible point of entry, the point at which a pro-life president could draw people into the conversation. I then prepared a draft for the debating kit of the first George Bush. I used to say, I wrote some of the best things that Ronald Reagan never said. And this was another one of those futile ventures. I prepared a draft for the debating kit of the first George Bush when he was prepared to debate, what's his name, the former governor of my state, Michael Dukakis. And I would have had Mr. Bush propose the most modest first step on abortion and say, look, we've been so divided on this question, we need a conversation before we can legislate again. The other side insists that abortion is not infanticide, which means that they're willing to protect the child at some point. Why don't we invite them to tell us when? And we'll begin there. And if nothing else is forthcoming, why don't we suggest, how about birth? Because the child is out, the interests of the mother are no longer entangled with the child, people can come forth to adopt the child. Why can't we begin with the simplest of all measure? Can we simply protect the child born alive who survives the abortion? Now, we never concealed our purpose here. The other side says, this is a first move, you're going to try to roll the whole thing back. Of course we're going to try to roll the whole thing back. Of course we can raise the question, what was different about that same child 5 minutes before it came out, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 months? Of course we're going to raise that. We did telegraph that. We admitted that. We said, but we'll try to engage you in a conversation and persuade you each step along the way. And if we fail to persuade you, well, then we fail to persuade you. But from that vast volume of 1.3 million abortions, we might be able to rescue even a handful of lives. And we didn't count that as any trifling matter. Well, this measure of ours was so modest that National Right to Life would not back it. They thought it was just too modest. They soon found something close to our measure, the bill on partial birth abortion, where the child was at the point of birth with 70% of the child dangling from the birth canal before the head of the child was crushed, the brains sucked out, and the child removed, so to speak, intact. In the litigation in New York, Judge Richard Conway Casey asked an anesthesiologist, Dr. Anand, did you ever think of administering an anesthetic to that child with the legs dangling out? Well, no, why would we do that? That child just didn't count. It was like that old part in Huck Finn, where Huck was inventing a story to Aunt Sally. Why were you delayed? Well, the steamboat blew the cylinder. He said, oh, man, anybody killed? Anybody hurt? Oh, no, ma'am, just a nigger killed. Oh, it's a good thing. Sometimes real people get hurt in these things. You never thought of administering an anesthetic? Well, the baby was screamed out. Didn't count. When Bill Clinton vetoed the bill on partial birth abortion, he told us about the mother who would be denied the surgery and concerns about her health, of the health of that other being in the picture, whose head was being crushed and the brain sucked out. He had absolutely nothing to say because that being just didn't count and didn't register. Well, but our friends at National Right to Life thought this was just too modest a bill, but suddenly things changed when the Supreme Court struck down that bill on, I was there that day, this bill on partial birth abortion in Nebraska, and by implication, the bills in 31 other states. And then Doug Johnson, Right to Life, decided, well, let's come back with Hadley's bill. That's the only thing we have to go with. We had Dick Posner, Judge Posner in Wisconsin, twitting us about this bill and saying, but you people never claimed to protect the child, after all. So what interest does the state have in shifting the killing of the child back from the birth canal to the uterus? And he had a point. They never sought to protect the child herself. So I was taking that line from Andrew Jackson, attributed to Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans, when he supposedly said, boys, I want you to elevate them guns a little lower. I want you to draw it back, take it back. I want to protect the child herself, okay? Doug Johnson was just smiling ear to ear. I led the testimony in the House at the Judiciary Committee that day. Doug was absolutely smiling. He couldn't believe that the National Abortion Rights Action League would come out in opposition to this move to protect the child born alive. And that revealed one of the strangest parts of this story, that our adversaries understood this bill better than our own allies. Henry Hyde and others could, why was it worth doing something so modest? But our adversaries understood it because they saw the principle that lay at the heart of the thing. They could see where it would go once we did this, okay? The federal bill on partial birth abortion was passed in 2003, and let me just back and say, even after we finally passed the bill, and by the way, we passed it with the Democrats in control of the Senate, and it was the Assistant Democratic leader, Mr. Harry Reid, who brought it forth to the House, where it passed, Senate, where it passed unanimously, a voice vote. And even now, as I'll point in a moment, the pro-life groups don't seem to understand that this most modest of all measures to protect the child who survives is one of the most powerful tools right now in the pro-life arsenal and not being used. The federal bill on partial birth abortion was passed in 2003, and hanging over everything was the awareness that the court had already struck down the same bill passed in Nebraska and other states. The federal bill was being contested in the courts, but while it was being litigated, I pointed out that what the courts were enjoining so far was the bill that actually barred the surgery, but still left open another path of argument. About 70 to 80% of the public opposed this gruesome procedure. And so it's open to Mr. Bush to propose that federal funds should be barred from any hospital or clinic that houses the partial birth abortions. Now, conservatives have usually been averse to this method of legislating by indirection. The reach of the federal government has been extended over the last 40 to 50 years in accord with the reach of the liberal agenda by simply offering grants. Offering grants. If people accept the grants, then the federal rules come along. We still don't know how the federal government can actually establish birth control clinics in the states. If you accept the money, then the rules come along. If you don't accept the money, no obligations, nothing is legislated. Okay? Now, I would have had Mr. Bush and the Republicans just have the bill introduced and have the president raise the tension also, by simply posing this question to the Judiciary Committee to mull over. With the formulas of the Civil Rights Acts apply, in particular the Civil Rights Restoration Act of 1988. With the Civil Rights Restoration Act, if a student receives a loan from the federal government and uses it at a private college, the whole college becomes a recipient of federal funds, and the full panoply of federal regulations would come to bear on all parts of the college. And under that construal, if a student at Georgetown would receive a loan, then Georgetown may be compelled to perform abortions in its hospitals. That part was blocked, but still the understanding remained that if a student received a loan, the whole place became a recipient of funds, federal funds. So I wanted Mr. Bush simply to pose this question to the Judiciary Committee. What is a recipient of federal funds? Does a facility, a clinic, become a recipient of federal funds if someone walks into the building who's receiving Medicare, Social Security check, a refund from the IRS? Well, of course, you know, and Milton Friedman once said, this is like saying that any A&P place that has somebody using food stamps becomes a recipient of federal funds. Okay, but this is what the formulas that the left enacted. Let's test them. But of course, any hospital is a recipient of federal funds. And now under Obamacare, just about any medical facility will come under grants and regulations from the government. Now, faced with those proposals, there's no way in which the party of abortion could possibly back away, because they'd be compelled to resist. Because if Congress could use the spending and the taxing power to place this kind of restriction on abortion, Congress could start restricting abortion all the way across the time limit. All across, they could cut it back to the first trimester and even before that. They could cut it back when situations with the child may be disabled or suffering with Down syndrome. And the Democrats would have to resist. By resisting this scheme of legislating they'd have to resist, because this is the way that the controls of the federal government have been extended over the last 50 years. But if they did, they'd be asking us to help them dismantle this whole system by which the reach of the federal government has been extended. As I argued to Karl Rove, this is a win-win proposition. They want us to do that? Fine, we'll help them. We'll help them dismantle this whole system. Right? But the level of tension could be heightened, the possibilities powerfully enlarged, and the deeper surprise sprung when the Born Alive Infants Protection Act is connected to a case that now has iconic standing among liberals, the famous case of the Bob Jones University case of 1983. The university, this fundamentalist university, lost its tax exemption because it barred students from dating and marriage across racial lines. The allegation was that the policies of the university were not in accord with the public policy of the United States. Well, what public policy? The university could not be sued under the Civil Rights Act because, as it turned out, no student was barred on the basis of race from any program or from the university. And in all strictness, there was nothing in the statutes or executive orders of the United States that barred people from discriminating on the basis of race in their private choices of partners in sex and marriage. In fact, at the time, we had, I recall, in the New York Review of Books, mainly journals on the left, you'd have personals ads that would read this way: SWM seeks SWF. What does that mean? Single white male seeking single white female. Now, you know damn well, the New York Review of Books would never print an ad saying white landlord seeking white tenant. What this indicated was that even for people in the advanced left, it was still legitimate in private choices of partners in sex and marriage to discriminate privately on the basis of race. So you say, well, let's connect this. There was no statute there, but now, with the Born Alive Act, there is a statute. And any place that is housing that act would be not in accord with public policy and should lose its tax exemption. It doesn't even require litigation. All it requires is a complaint to the IRS and an administration willing to act on the complaint. If we had a Republican pro-life administration coming into office now, I would have been pressing for a new move to enforce the Born Alive Infants Protection Act. A new administration could have instructed the IRS to start accepting these complaints, but even better would have been now the move to hold hearings to add. We took out the penalties for killing a child born alive. Charles Kennedy, the chairman of the committee, wanted this as mainly a teaching bill to plant premises in the law and to avoid a veto from President Clinton. We never added the penalties. But now, no Democrat in Congress voted against that bill. Now we can come back with hearings, because it turns out Jill Stanek, this brave nurse at the Christ Hospital in Oak Lawn, Illinois, is the one who blew the whistle on the so-called live birth abortion, where the child is delivered whole and simply put in a refuse room to die. And this may be, she thinks this could be the abortion choice for the middle class because it's the safest of all. No instruments are introduced into the body of the mother. No need to sort of pull out the parts of the dismembered child where left behind they could be the cause of infection. And as Jill got on the radio back in Chicago, nurses were calling in from all over the country saying, you know, we've been doing that in our hospital for years. This is just much more frequent and voluminous than even we suspected at the time. And now we have this doctor in Philadelphia, this fellow Kermit Gosnell, who explicitly makes a practice of killing the babies who survive the abortions. He cuts the neck with the scissors and then severs spinal cords. This has been something muffled by the media of late, in the way they muffled any news of the Born Alive Infants Protection Act, but we have something on the record now. We could bring this forth for hearings, and we say, look, no Democrat in Congress voted against this bill. You all thought it was wrong. Well, what kind of a wrong was it? What kind of a penalty would you add now to somebody who would do this to a child? Would it be at least as serious as a moving violation of traffic? Tell us. A good question to point out. These are the issues we would have raised in a sharp way, or we might be able to do even now with the Republicans in control of the House, but there's very little incentive to do it because there's little prospect that a bill of this kind would pass, and yet there could be some reason to hold the hearings and have the issue out. But my point again is that the possibility of bringing us to the end game of abortion were well within our grasp had we not had in Mr. Bush a figure replicated by Republican presidential candidates, including John McCain and Mitt Romney, people who are just disinclined to talk about these issues in public because they had the sense that people were uncomfortable in talking about them, even though the issues of abortion and marriage have been net winners for conservative and Republican candidates. My friend Robbie George at Princeton used to say about the first George Bush that his problem for the pro-life movement was that he was all action and no talk. He did things, but he didn't want to talk. And what we needed was the talk that framed the question. Okay? And we've seen this recently with the problems of Mr. Todd Akin and Richard Murdoch, really good people in the last election who ran into troubles presenting the issue. They didn't know how to defend themselves. And one of the problems here is that some of the pro-lifers are just such nice people. A candidate tells them they're pro-life and they're willing to settle for that. And they don't want to press to see if that candidate can give reasons to defend his position. They have the hardest question of all on abortion in the case of rape. And the public passion is running deep on that. As Lincoln said about slavery and about interracial marriage, there's a public passion running here. It's hard to resist it. Abortion in the case of rape accounts about 0.5%. The problem for us is we say you have to tell the other side, you understand, our position is predicated on the innocence of the child. Are you claiming that the child bears some responsibility for the rape? We can make a prudential accommodation with you, but don't ask us to endorse this in principle and give up the very ground of our position. Well, this melancholy issue takes us back to the problem of our own political class. The conservative political class and how they've managed persistently to lose when we've had the materials in hand now for leading the public step by step through measures that we know the public, even people who call themselves pro-choice, steps that they would support. And the story of our bill to preserve the life of the child who survives is told as part of a memoir in my book with Cambridge Press, Natural Rights and the Right to Choose, a kind of memoir. And they argued in that book that as people talked themselves into the right to choose, they began to talk themselves out of the very logic of natural rights. And with that, they strip away the moral claims of any sense of the moral rightness that it could attach to abortion. I realized when Teresa mentioned natural right, and it's another talk I gave, it's probably worth just a minute, a riff on this one. Thomas Aquinas said that the divine law we know through revelation, but the natural law we know through that reasoning that is accessible to human beings as human beings, natural to human beings. And in my own teaching, there has been no example that is clear to people about the reasoning of natural law than that fragment that Lincoln wrote for himself when he imagines himself engaged in a conversation with an owner of slaves, putting the question, why are you justified in making a slave of the black man? Is it because he's less intelligent than you? Ah, beware. The next white man who comes along, more intelligent than you, may rightly enslave you. Is it because he's darker than you? Ah, beware again. The next white man who comes along with a complexion even lighter than yours may enslave you. It was simply a model of principled reasoning. At no point in the chain of reasoning was there an appeal to revelation. This is that could be understood across the religious division, it could be understood by Catholics, Baptists, backgammon players. It could be understood across the way. And those of us in the pro-life movement are simply drawn on the same model of reasoning when it comes to abortion, the natural rights reasoning. So we say, why is that child in the womb anything less, that offspring anything less than human? Doesn't speak yet? Neither do deaf mutes. Doesn't have arms or legs? Other people lose arms or legs in the course of their lives without losing anything necessary to their standing as human beings to receive the protections of the law. In other words, you don't have to be Catholic to understand this position, but that has been precisely the position of the Church, that this is a matter of the moral reasoning of the natural law combined with embryology, no appeals to mere belief and to faith. That's what we're dealing with here now. The argument here I made in the book. I was arguing that to the extent that people were affirming the right to choose, they were rejecting the very logic of natural right, and in that way they were stripping even the right to abortion of its moral logic. And if you permit me, I'll bring this talk to a close by simply recalling those three vignettes and how they played out. In the first, I was having a conversation with a fine student of mine at my office who leaned into me and said, you know, I've never really been as enamored of natural rights as you've been. Really? Why is that? Well, as the conversation moved, it took a turn to that fellow in the gutter who had broken his own life and say, why is it that we treat him, even in his diminished state, as some bearer of rights or dignity? And my student did what we could call a kind of postmodernist song and dance. Well, it's kind of to do with the lens by which we in our culture have come to view. I said, whoa, wait a minute. I asked you about him. You tell me about our lens, how we viewed him. I want to know, you stopped talking about him. Is there something about him that makes him the bearer of an intrinsic dignity that becomes in turn the source of rights of an intrinsic dignity? Him. What does he have? And the second involved, I had a commission to do a piece on the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And I went through with my dear friend Alan Greenberg, the architect. And as we took a turn, we took a turn that probably people in here have taken. We came across this vast vat filled with shoes, where the Nazis collected the shoes they could salvage or use again. And curiously, what came sort of flashing back at that moment were those searing words of Justice McClain when he was dissenting in the Dred Scott decision. And he leaned in and he said, you may think that black man is chattel, but he's a creature made in the impress of his maker. He's amenable to the laws of God and man, and he is destined to an endless existence. That is, he has a soul that will not decompose when his material existence comes to an end. And I thought that you got the full measure of the situation when you realize the Nazis looked at this scene and they thought the shoes were the durables. The shoes were the durables. And the last one came not far from us in Brookline, Massachusetts, where there had been a shooting at an abortion clinic. A couple of people were killed. And a couple of nights later, there was a candlelight vigil of people out there to defend the right to abortion and reproductive rights. And one woman was there with her newborn infant daughter. And she said she was there to protect her daughter's reproductive rights, including the right to have killed that child up through and past the time of birth. We said, now that's interesting. If she had those reproductive rights, were they a species of natural rights? James Wilson, one of our great founders, raised the question, if we have natural rights, when do they begin? He said, as soon as we begin to be, which is why he says the common law casts protection over human life from the first stirrings in the womb, as soon as we know it's there. Well, if this was a species of natural rights, her reproductive rights were natural rights, so that daughter in the womb had them as soon as she began to be as a female. And if she had those rights when she was in the womb, her mother clearly could not have had the franchise to have swept away all of those rights through the simple expedient of sweeping away in a stroke the bearer of those rights. So it must have had another story. It must have been that the mother, in a grand Nietzschean gesture, said, I now confer upon you the right to live, because there's nothing about you I regard as inconsistent with my interests. Well, if that's the way it is, and it has to be, then we understand that this right to abortion, or reproductive rights, is not a natural right. It's a right that is conferred by the powerful as it suits the interests of the powerful to confer it. It doesn't begin with any rights of intrinsic dignity in the child itself, because it doesn't begin with a recognition of anything intrinsic dignity in that child. And if that's the story of how we get our rights, it's a story of our essential nakedness of rights until they are conferred by the people who have the power to confer them, and last only so long as they are willing to keep them conferred. Now, I'm saying, if I suppose for a moment that there is something called the right to abortion, you have now stripped it of its moral logic, so it becomes nothing much more august than the right to use the squash courts at Amherst College. That's not what we're talking about. I move to my finish. The melancholy fact of the matter is that even people at the best colleges, among them, there's been a serious erosion of confidence over the years that we can have rational knowledge of the things that are right or wrong. And so we shouldn't be surprised to find that even affable people with decent motives and college educations have fallen into paths quite plausible and familiar that move them away from the sense that there's any importance attached to the discipline of giving reasons and justifications for what they're doing. And when they detach themselves from that disposition, they detach themselves also from the understanding that the life of giving reasons. So what we're doing with the Born Alive Act is we're forcing the other side to tell us why they can support this or give us their reasons. In fact, we're going to put in a preamble, we put this to the other side to say, if you're voting for this bill, it must be that you must recognize that even that child for an abortion, marked for an abortion, has a claim to the protection of the law, and if that's the case, it cannot be contingent on her location or whether she serves the interests of anyone else. Now, if we have that wrong, correct it. Are you protecting the child because it pleases you to protect it? And would you cease to protect the child when it ceased to please you? If that's what you mean, tell us. Give us your reasons. Now, a political class that's reluctant to engage in that kind of thing, to force the other side to claim their real name, to give us their reasons. when people detach themselves from that disposition, they detach themselves also from the understanding that the life of giving reasons is bound up with the justification of political life itself and the nature of that creature who alone has the capacity to give and understand reasons over matters of right and wrong. And without quite realizing, these people detach themselves from the very understanding of the human person that underlies this constitutional order and their own rights. A political class, my pitch to you is that a political class that has lost the sense that the reasons matter is a political class that may serve in positions of state, and yet its members will have lost their vocation, because at times the need to clarify the principles entails the need to stage the confrontation or the debate, and that may indeed involve at times the need to pick a fight. A political class that's persistently reluctant to show that kind of a spirited nature will produce not merely a politics that's banal, but one that is denatured. Because in removing the conflict, in removing the argument, one may be gently removing as well the moral substance. You know, Aristotle remarked at one of his most memorable observations in the physics that if the art were in the material, we'd expect to see ships growing out of trees. Well, ships were not part of the world of causation produced through the workings of the laws of nature. Ships were part of a world governed by design, by the awareness of ends, by the shaping of reasons. Now, we may be bringing forth a political class now. This is my concern. We may be bringing forth a political class more and more detached from the sense that there's any particular importance in compelling the other side to come out with their reasons and claim them as their own. And to a political class molding itself in that way, we may not only ask, well, where is the reason that gives meaning to political life, but beyond that, where in all of that is the art? The art. Where do we find the distinctive hand that shows your work? Where do we find the design that marked your understanding? The touch that reflected the experience you had cultivated? And where, finally, do we find the impression, lingering through time, that we were here? We were here. Thanks very much. Listen. Thank you. I have to take notice of a dear friend who's joined us, Josephine Stannard, the mother of one of my dearest students. Joe, over here, raise your hands, we can see you. Great supporter, great lady, great supporter, great Minnesotan. Are there any questions here? It's all performance art, I just leave.
My concern is that we're not proving to him that we are educating a class of public citizens who can pick a fight and demand an argument.
Oh,
so
no,
come on,
they might
students.
just be absorbing and thinking about it, that's all. There's nothing to that.
James.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Professor Arkes. Arkes?
Arkes.
Arkes, excellent. You're one of the great tacticians of the pro-life movement, as you've just laid out, talking about many of the good incremental battles we've fought in the last 20 years. I'm curious, there's this new breed of bills that have been coming out of the state legislatures, the Personhood Bills. And I've heard some fights about whether or not they're tactically sound or not, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on them. And in particular, given that they seem to be happening whether or not the National Right to Life Committee approves of them or not, does it make more sense for us to get in the trenches and fight for them, despite the fact they force us to answer very awkward questions about in vitro fertilization and rape abortions? Or should we stand back and let Planned Parenthood have its way with its billion-dollar lie machine in North Dakota and Mississippi and other places?
Well, I don't mean to be, it's a fine question for a couple of reasons. I see some, I was a little disappointed to see a comment made by a friend of mine in Washington on the North Dakota bill on the heartbeats. Say, of course the courts are going to strike this down. And what we have here is the vice of Justice Holmes, who said, but what we mean by law is a prediction of what judges are likely to do. And so some of these pro-life lawyers come forth with the, well, it's not likely to be constitutional because a judge is likely to strike. That is not the answer. The question is before us. The question should be presented. Don't surrender in advance that kind of thing. On the other hand, what makes their position, so I'd say, you make that up. We know that in the surveys, 62% of the public say they would think abortion can be barred after the beating of the heart. They just don't know when it is. So you bring out when it is. Force them to face that question and see if we can force the press to report it. Just as they wouldn't report the Born Alive Infants Protection Act. They managed to muffle that. But I think what the plausible thing to be said on the side of my friends on the other side, that if the thing is just too gross, if it isn't presented in a very careful, disarming way, making it harder for people to resist, if it looks just like an assertion, it will be treated just like an assertion, and a court can flippantly, dismiss it. And you want to be careful of that, because then it builds up, and here are these crazy pro-lifers, they're doing all these things, which of course we know are wrongful. But I say again, should not be our business to engage in a kind of preemptive surrender by making predictions as to what liberal judges are going to do. If they're judges, let them earn their livelihood by judging and facing the case and giving us their reasons, and let us appeal them. Because in the meantime, we know, Mr. Justice, every so often I see at the University Club Monsignor Vaghi in a corner with Mr. Justice Kennedy, and I hope Monsignor Vaghi is taking confession when I see that. But Mr. Justice Kennedy's willing to go along and sustain these things. Let's keep putting it to him. The practice is not bad. So I think I take the disposition of your question. I think it's a good disposition. It's a good reflex. You think there's reason to support it, make the case, and let the other side do the work in coming forth with the reasons for rejecting it. I think that's quite right.
Next question. I saw other hands. Yes.
Let me go clear to the other end, from the tactical to the philosophical, and look at your title for a minute and ask this question. If we begin our argument with the existence of natural rights, and the point of the argument is to get to the conclusion that there's no right to abortion, or to put it the other way, that the fetus as well as the child has a right to life, do we get that conclusion out of the very existence of natural rights, or do we need a second premise that states what the contents of those rights are, so that the abortion rights proponent might say, I believe in natural rights too, but the right I believe in is the right to make choices, including the choice of abortion. You see,
well, one of the arguments we made under the Commerce Clause, you could say, well, an abortion definitely interferes with the freedom of a fetus to travel in interstate commerce. And you say, well, that's not exactly the argument we want to make. I think, yeah, there are many other things that are barred, but I think we'd be better off simply concentrating on the question of life. Life becomes central to everything else. You can't do anything else unless you're in existence and have that life. It's a profound question to say, what are the grounds in which you are depriving, put it another way, withdrawing the protections of life from this class of human beings. My friend Scalia joins other conservatives in insisting that the court can do nothing other than return the matter to the states, that the Supreme Court cannot judge these questions. And in dealing with that, I mused about this problem. Let's suppose that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Civil War amendments, were understood. People argued at the time that they were for blacks who became human. Not for all blacks, but for blacks who are human. Because, after all, we know, we've been told, have we not, that not everything conceived of human beings is human at all stages. And Justice Scalia has told us that the 9 members of the court cannot pronounce on the question of when human life begins any more than the first 9 names in the telephone directory, so we send it back to the states. And the state gives us a color wheel. And when we think if it's lighter, it's more human, has higher SATs, we know what the courts would do with that. They treat this as arbitrary. We'd say, what are the grounds on which you are removing a whole class of human beings from the class of beings who are protected by the law to a class of beings whose lives may be taken without the need to render a justification? This isn't good enough. The courts will recognize it. So then we come back to them and say, well, how is it any different to say that you're withholding the protections of the law because of the height or the weight of this offspring? It can't be anything other than human. You don't think the rights of anyone else depends on his height or weight or his degree of articulation. So I think in that hard question of life, we have the most profound question we have. And of course, everything else falls from that. His freedom to enter St. Thomas and get a law degree and everything else is, yes, cut off at the same time. But I think that's what I'm pointing to, again, you might say, is the discipline of giving a justification. Tell us the ground on which you're removing this class of beings who cannot be anything other than human beings, the ground on which you're removing them from a class of people protected by the law to a class of people who are no longer, but that's not simply describing, that is a moral shift, right? And that's I think, essentially how I would move with that one. But I'm always open to hearing a better argument. Okay.
Other questions?
Yeah, over here.
Yes.
Oh, Professor, I got a 2-part question for you.
Uh-oh.
All right. One is on the private sector. Like, if an abortion clinic is completely private, why should it be compelled by federal statutes to not engage in abortion? And how is that promoting the general welfare if you're completely taking away the freedom of choice in all regards and from anyone? And another one.
Oh, wait, hold on, because, you know, as I'm getting older, I may lose some of these things, you know, because there are a couple of interesting parts. First of all, we understand that a homicide, a murder in a private bedroom is every much as much a murder as a murder in the house, in the public street. Once you're in the presence of a wrong, the differences between the public and the private may disappear. If there are assassination plans for President of the United States in the bedroom of a house, we can get access to that. We've had people trying to smuggle drugs into the country by hiding drugs in their body cavities. And believe it or not, the courts with warrants and pincers have been able to get access to those things in very private places. Now, this is not a matter, we've seen when it comes, say, to private businesses open to transactions with the public accommodations, the Civil Rights Act barred those kinds of discriminations even in private places. But what I want to point out to you here is, normally, as you point out, the laws on homicide come from the states and local governments. The laws of the states and local governments all banned the homicide of abortion with some exceptions. The reason these offspring are vulnerable to killing is a function of the fact that a branch of the federal government, the federal courts, swept away those protections. So the matter of restoring the protections is not as much a matter of enacting a federal statute on homicide, but returning to recognize again the authority of the states to treat homicide, including the homicide of those infants in the womb. Okay, and second part.
All right, so like we said earlier on the degree of articulation with people, okay, aren't people who are biologically dependent on another human, say connected intravenously through the womb or hooked up to machines, what about those who are brain damaged? Does not another human make the call to abort their life as well?
What do you mean, if people are in fact dead?
When when, excuse me, brain damaged people. Like if you're in a vegetative state, another human makes the call in order to terminate the life of the person who's in the vegetative state.
Well,
couldn't the same argument be made for aborting a fetus?
Yeah, but of course, what we're seeing is what we're learning again more recently is that people, first of all, it's the imagery is wrong. Uncle Julius has not become slipped from a human to a rutabaga. He's not a vegetable. He's a very sick human being. And what we've seen of late is that people we think are in a vegetative state have been communicating. Tell us, you know, we do these simple tests have come out late. Blink your eyes twice. We've had we've had these remarkable experiments lately with you ask people questions and things involving their spatial relations and different parts of the brain light up. We know when they're, and they've been conducting conversations. So it's not so clear that these people are dead. There's an Isaac Singer used to say, Yiddish is a dying language. And he said, well, there's a big difference between dying and dead. And you know, Sal Bell used to talk about concerns about dead white males. You said, I'm concerned, I almost am one. I have a certain kind of reluctance here. So see, part of your question is, would you kill those people now outside the womb who are suffering from the same problem? And I guess the same protocols you bring forth to decide when their life has ended would be engaged here. But just as I remember seeing years ago in Detroit, a veteran in a wheelchair saying they're ordering up abortions for babies who might have my problem. You see. If you're not clear that you would order death for the person who's disabled and suffering these problems, it's not a different order of problems to talk about another human being manifesting the same problems, but in another location. See? So I put it in that way. That doesn't, of course, evade the hard question you're putting about the ending of life under those difficult circumstances. I don't mean to evade that one. I just want to say that just as people, like Roger Rosenblatt was at the New Republic years ago, was astonished to discover that most people in the country did not think it was right to order an abortion of the child because the child might be deaf. And their unwillingness to accept the abortion was utterly indifferent to the stage of gestation. And it could be that people in the country realized that since they don't regard deafness as a ground to end the life of anyone else, they would not end it for a child in the womb, no matter how old. It could be people are making this connection. But of course, how they're making this connection in a culture that seems to be eroding our capacity to reason about these things in a disciplined way is one of the great mysteries, is that how it still hangs on.
Another question.
We may, do you have another? I think
no, go right ahead.
No, I think people have been very nice to stay. Maybe we could just if there's one more, I don't want to. I remember once telling an audience in Virginia, if I don't get a question, I'm going to do Kant's answer to Hume. But it could be, I could leave you with that line of Woody Allen's and say that, reworking and say, there's no question that there's a moral world. The only question is, how far is it from Midtown? How late does it stay open? Thanks very much.
We're very grateful for Professor Arkes.